Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Julie, for joining us from North America and South America. And thanks for waking up at this very unearthly hour to give us your time. Diego, I'd like to sort of begin by sort of, based on your vast experience with wildlife and conservation biology and sort of landscape planning and sustainable enterprises, not just in Colombia, but in two, three countries in Central and South America. I'd like to give our audience a small presentation of your work, and then we can take the conversation forward from there.
Great, perfect. Okay, let me share with you a couple of slides so I can show you what we're doing here. So, well, thank you very much once again for the invitation. I will show you a couple of slides telling you what we have been doing back in Colombia regarding certification as a tool to improve landscape management and conservation of charismatic species in pretty diverse and complex conservation situations back in Colombia. We work within an NGO that is called PROCAT, and we are scientists. We are not based or focused on agricultural or economic units. We work in conservation of ecosystems and species, and that's what we have been doing for several years. But working within different landscapes, we managed to find that working with people and increasing their commonwealth and their economy and the way they are living, we can ensure that there is actually active conservation within different landscapes. So I'm going to tell you about one example that we are doing back in Colombia that it involves jaguars in one particular place of Colombia that is called Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And I'm going to explain you why. Maybe not many of you know what a jaguar is or what is happening in Latin America, but jaguars are the biggest wild-felled wildcat within America, actually, not only Latin America. They are extremely important, probably similar to what you have over there with tigers or what we find in North America with cougars and bears. And they manage a lot about what is happening in terms of the ecology of different systems. So if we have those kind of animals within our lands, usually the ecosystems are well, the prey that they eat that well, those kind of things. Also within Colombia, they are extremely important in terms of culture. Many of the indigenous groups that still live within the country have them within their cosmology and their cosmogony and how they believe and they understand their territories. And it's also an important key species and charismatic species within actual, not only indigenous people, but everybody within the country. Some of them see him as a friend, some of them see him as an enemy, and it's part of the interesting dynamic of working with these kind of animals. And as you know, most of these big carnivores are within some level of endangerment, or they are threatened. In particularly, jaguar is under vulnerable category by the UICN at Latin America and globally. And in Colombia, the species is endangered because here we evaluate that level of endangerment by populations, by small groups. And that's pretty sad because here what you see here is how is the species globally. It's only located within Latin America and Central America, a little bit of North America, but just like cross the border and come back, and crossing the border gets harder and harder. But as you see here, this red spot here is Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And that particular spot is pretty red because it's isolated from most of the other populations. And what is happening there is that we have this little patch of beautiful forest, completely unconnected and being threatened every single day. So for those that don't know where that is, this little patch here is Sierra Nevada. It's in the north of Colombia. This is Colombia, north of South America. And as you see, most of our natural forests still exist within the Amazon, but this northern part of the country has been changing a lot in the last years. Even when it's an amazing place, and if any of you can come at some moment, you will be completely dazzled and impressed of what we have over there. Because as you see, this is an elevation map. This is Sierra, and you see that is like the highest, that's actually the highest mountain peak in the country and the highest coastal mountain of the world. which make it amazing in terms of ecosystems, what we have there, species, cultural diversity. Over there are several indigenous groups isolated using the mountain as a barrier for several years since the Spaniards came to the colony 500 years ago. And that has allowed that the mountain has a bunch of the cultural diversity and different people living within it, but also have a lot of problems. So now if you see over here, what you see is this little green patch that seems beautiful. That's the only remaining forest within the region. The rest, that is this yellowish and orange colors, is the transformation, which has been a trend in the last year, and that had made that habitat loss, reduction of natural praise, conflict with rural lands are pretty common, getting within two particular things. One, conflicts within production units. There's a lot of jaguars attacking different domestic animals. And at the end, the death of the jaguars because people get extremely angry about their losses and the lack of response from the government and the institutions that live over there, and they take the actions by their hands. And that's pretty bad for the species. So what we have is this beautiful landscape. This is Sierra. You see over there the snowy peaks right at the end of the picture, that has this beautiful forest and has been changing to this. So a lot of deforestation, a lot of transformation to a small cattle ranch patches that are working within the highlands of the mountain, and palm oil surrounding all the mountain. So then we start to ask, okay, what are we going to do? How can we actually change this? And there's where not us, but they, the farmers and the people that live within these areas, decide that working with certifications and working with economic strategies was the best way to actually ensure conservation within the mountain. So here you can see a couple of mountains of us asking around the mountain, like, what can we do? What do you think is the best solution? And then we start to work a lot with coffee growers. Coffee within Colombia and within Sierra is pretty amazing because it has a lot of forest above. Because over there we have this that is called shade coffee. So we require that particular vertical structure of the forest to ensure that the coffee grows well. But that's good for biodiversity because we can have a lot of different cool things happening there. So they tell us we can work with certifications, but the main problem is that the usual ones, like fair trade, flow, organic, are extremely out of range of what they can actually pay or how they can actually transform their lands. So working with them, we of course find wildlife friendly enterprise that I know Julie will explain maybe later what it is, or maybe you have been already talking about it, but it's an enterprise that is helping us move forward this science and this narrative about conservation of wildlife to an economic realm, ensuring that that particular units of or economic units ensure the conservation of the species. And then we work together to define this new narrative of conserving jaguars through economic units, ensuring that we can have coffee growers doing what they do best, but helping maintain corridors, connectivity, and habitat for these particular species. And also increase the science and the understanding of this beautiful animal that we see walking right here, because they are helping us do participatory monitoring. So they are the ones that are doing science within their lands and ensuring that the certification move forward. This is the logo that we have, and this is how we have been talking about it. And it started in Costa Rica. This was the first farm that was certified a couple of years ago. And now we have moved to other several farmers within Sierra Nevada. And it has been great because it has moved the conversation nationally and internationally regarding how we can do this. These are different screenshots of newspapers and news that have been moving since we made the certification. And that help us also move the idea of using economic units to conserve endangered species within Colombia. So we were working just in one particular area that was Sierra, but now we are moving to other areas of the country that have similar situations and are trying to enforce their conservation strategies and ways of doing things. of course, we have to do a bunch of more things, and I think and probably that's what we will talk right now, is how these small ideas and processes that we are doing, we can somehow relate them with bigger things like climate change. So try to ensure that those places are also in areas where we have the biggest carbon pools. That's one of the things that we are doing in Sierra. Also complement what we are doing with other ways of conservation. Now we are working a lot with indigenous groups and communal territories and other kinds of landscape management to ensure that these economic strategies somehow impact what they are doing, and we can enforce those other ways of conservation besides restricted protected areas. And also working to ensure that the conservation of the species happen also within even contrasting and really hard to manage lands like cattle ranches or palm oil, which is pretty bad in terms of biodiversity, but we have somehow to also impact those that are the main production units within their territory, so they can start to move toward the conservation of the species and the landscape where it lives. I think that's the brief resume of what we have been doing down here.
Great. Thanks a lot, Diego. So I mean, it all sort of looks very easy here, but I'm sure that the process of sort of going about convincing local communities or indigenous groups and small coffee growers to actually embark on this path, right? I mean, how did the whole journey begin? How did you convince people to actually make this switch? And what was sort of like the response? And I mean, how easy was it? How difficult was it? How long did it take you, like with the first jaguar friendly coffee plantation?
Well, it was hard. Julie can tell also the story of how long it has been. Because I think, and I think it's what you find in any particular situation where you have these different landscape interests and these different cultures living within the same land, but seeing it and understanding it from different perspectives. So some of them want cattle ranch, some of them want coffee, others want strict conservation, and you have to manage to put them all in a common place where they try to move forward the same conservation objective. So when we started, and it was interesting because we started working with cattle ranches in the lowlands that have the higher number of conflicts. So they were calling the government institutions, telling them the jaguar came here and once again eat my cow or eat my cattle, those kind of things. But then we start to receive these many other calls from coffee growers. And we were like, that's pretty weird. That shouldn't happen there. So when we move forward to these particular areas, we find that both they were having problems that they cannot manage. One particular year, there was a huge wildfire within the national park that moved some of the animals, and probably that kind of moved the jaguars toward the lowlands and start to eat within the coffee places. But also they have low economy. Most of the farms are bankrupt based on their economy. They have a weird conflictive relationship with environmental agencies, so they do not want to talk with them, which make that going these crazy people talking about jaguars within there and telling them we are going to conserve them and put some camera traps was not the best idea. Which means that we have to work probably for 4 years, I think, with them, understanding their economy, understanding what they need, understanding how was their coffee, and from there start to build these bridges of how can we get to that common place. But it wasn't easy. I think it's not easy yet. We still have a lot of work to do, but people is starting to understand that they can both make a profit and also get a conservation objective from it.
Thanks. So I think, Julie, I will now come to you. So, I mean, what seems to be kind of clear is that the conservation narrative is not always the first narrative that sort of convinces smallholders or convinces baseline farmers to make the shift. So what do you think as a part of your global vision for your enterprise, right? Because I mean, from what I can tell from the little that I've heard, not just from Diego, but from a few of the other wildlife friendly enterprises, is the fact that every solution has to be really customized, and every, not just a country, but I mean, even regions within countries are distinct because of the kind of people who are there. So how do you see wildlife friendly enterprises sort of go about this on a global scale? So what is the plan, and how do you think you can reach global scale but still be able to find people like Diego everywhere who will be able to find these niche customized solutions?
Yeah, first, we were very lucky to be connected with Diego and Jose and the ProCat team,
Yeah, yeah,
because our model relies on having these incredible partners on the ground, because
yeah,
we are not the experts in every landscape for every species, and we're
yeah,
not there building the relationships with the community. So our model relies on this. And just to touch on another challenge that Diego mentioned, is that a lot of the other certification programs are extremely expensive, and a lot of the communities living next to high biodiversity are producing on a scale that they can't afford those certifications. So we, by definition, wanted to operate differently. And while we have to pay our bills so we can stay in business, we never wanted the cost of the certification to be a barrier to rewarding incredible work in these high biodiversity areas where there isn't time to there are crises happening on the ground, environmental crises, and so there's not time to build that business to the point where they can afford a $10,000 audit. So those are all ways that we operate quite differently from the regular certification programs. And I think in some ways we're sort of the anti-certification because we want certification. The only reason we exist is to get conservation work done. But sometimes, as Diego was pointing out, you have to come at it sort of backwards. And so I'm just going to tell one quick story, because I think it illustrates my insight into how this work happens, which is from a different project I was working on years ago with wolves in Montana. And I was headed out to have I was on the board of an organization and headed out to have a barbecue with some ranchers in Montana who do not love wolves in any way, shape, or form, and are never going to love wolves. But the organization I was on the board of had developed a program to hire cowboys, gauchos, to ride out with the cattle during the summer when they were on public lands to protect them from wolves, and they had radio collared the wolves. Anyway, as I'm driving out to have this barbecue, we get a call that a wolf has been killed. And this is right before the ranchers are going to send the cattle to market. So they've lost money out of their pocket from this. And legally at that time, it was legal for the rancher to shoot the wolf. And so I thought, well, the barbecue is going to be called off. This is a mess. Like this whole trip has turned into a disaster. And as we're driving out to talk to the rancher, I pulled him aside and I said, I'm just curious why you didn't shoot the wolf when nobody was looking and it was within your legal right. And he said, I didn't do it because of Janelle. Well, Janelle was the person I was there with. She was the daughter of a ranching family, but she was running this program. And he said, Janelle would have been mad at me if I had shot the wolf. And I care for Janelle. I trust Janelle, and I didn't want her to be disappointed in me. So that's why I didn't shoot the wolf. And I had a light bulb go off in that moment. And I said, when people ask what our vision for success is, it's what do people do when no one's looking? And not necessarily because we've made them love jaguars, because that may never happen, but because we've developed a relationship based on trust and respect. And so we've touched on some of those things in other conversations, but I just thought I'd share that, because that's really the vision for success. Is not, if people become, start loving tigers, fantastic. But if they don't, you need someone like Diego on the ground who has that relationship. And that's why we use that model. Sorry for the long answer, but I thought it was a good illustration.
No, that was perfect. Perfect. Thanks, Judy. So I think from that, Diego, I'd sort of like to dig deeper for the benefit of our audience as well into trying to understand sort of like, what is I mean, you have briefly mentioned the state of the forest and the state of wildlife in Colombia. But I think what would be very interesting for our audience to understand is sort of how is land ownership managed in this region? So even if we just sort of talk about Sierra Nevada de Santa Maria, who owns most of the land? Is it indigenous communities? Is it local communities? And what are the major development pressures there? And what is the sort of view of communities towards these pressures, and what are their rights like on land and on natural resources in general?
Well, it's as many countries. It's pretty complex. It changes a lot within Colombia. It changes a lot depending on which part of the country you are. We usually have three kind of land rights within the country. One of them is private, right? Like people buy their lands and they have it. A lot of other areas are managed strictly by the government. So we have protected lands and protected areas and forest reserves and those kind of things. Some of them pretty well managed, some of them a little bit messy because they haven't have the ensurement that they can manage it in a proper way. So there's a bunch of illegality within some of the boundaries, mostly of the forest reserves. It's something that at this moment the environmental agency is working on to try to ensure that the land is managed properly and they can also fulfill the needs of the people that has been occupying those lands in an illegal way. And a lot of the country, probably I will say around 40%, goes within communal territories that are divided into different kinds of communal territories. One by indigenous groups, most of them in the Amazon and some particular indigenous reserves within the country. And the other ones that are communal territories for the people that live in the Pacific area mostly, that is colored people that has traditional rights and has traditional values within the land that also came here as slaves and have been growing as a cultural group and has legal rights within their lands. Those are mostly the ones that we have. In Sierra, for example, we have a huge protected area that I will say it covers probably 70 or 60% of the mountain range, not of all the region, but of the mountain range. And it's overlapped with 3 different indigenous reserves. And those indigenous reserves are managed by 4 different cultural groups. So you can start to imagine the complexity that runs around. And the protected areas have made an interesting, I think, goal, and they have been managing in such way that is that protected areas and indigenous and communal territories are the same. So they have to work hand by hand, and they have to ensure that the conservation goals go in the same way. And all the management plans and landscape management plans have been built with these communal territories to ensure their conservation. But in the places where the protected area is no longer there, so in Sierra we have the protected area that it's like this, and the indigenous territory that is like this. So these boundaries are the ones that are more complex, because even when the indigenous groups have their legal rights, they have not been able to buy them, so they overlap with private territories. And their main goal is to increase that, because they are trying to gain their traditional territory, which is not a political boundary, which is like this. It's bigger. So that creates a lot of conflict within the different stakeholders in the region. And working within this particular project and other projects that we work in the area, it has been challenging because indigenous groups are also using these economic tools and certifications and the same narrative to move forward their management and their objectives. And landowners are doing the same. So at some moment they share the same value, but they conflict within the land. But I think it's the usual reality within these complex territories.
I see. That's so. I think it is sort of similar in this part of India, and we generally notice that sort of conservation efforts or conservation goals are more easily met in areas which are run by indigenous groups or community-owned land. And we've seen that sort of rates of deforestation have also been much lower in the last 30 years on indigenous land versus land that is meant to be a protected area. Do you see a similar trend in Colombia?
Yeah, I do. I think probably one of the main reasons is because it's easy to get to a share point or a common goal within the indigenous group that has a huge land and have a usually a government structure that allow us to have a clear conversation, in difference to private lands that you have 70 or 80 different owners with a different perspective of what they want to do with their land. That by one side. And the other one, and within Colombia has been truth, the conservation within the communal territories and the way they live within the communal territories ensure conservation of biodiversity. So you can see, and there are a couple of papers and studies that have shown that the way they are living for sure ensures that biodiversity conservation forest keeps on going. And within Sierra, which is pretty neat, we have been working with one particular indigenous community that are called the Kogi. And Kogi community, you go to their lands and they are extremely respectful of the value of nature, extremely respectful of how these particular places are sacred places, and to keep on going, they have to maintain the biodiversity that's around them. So when they have that integrated with their way of thinking and their way of mind, it's pretty easy to move forward to a conservation objective.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Julie, I'd be curious to know if there's sort of like a correlation between wildlife-friendly outcomes across wildlife-friendly enterprises and sort of like the ownership status or the governance status of these enterprises. I mean, so what I'm implying at are indigenous-run, indigenous-owned enterprises usually, I mean, is it easier to have conservation-based impact outcomes? Or have you seen a trend? Or
I think what I could say is basically touching on what Diego just said, which is that where conservation goals overlap with cultural identity and values and spiritual beliefs, conservation work is much easier to do because the goals are the same, and anything that touches on someone's cultural identity is such a strong belief that it means everything is moving in the same direction from the conservation groups and so with that shared sort of vision worldview, it makes conservation work easier. I think that is true everywhere. I mean, not just with wildlife friendly, but anywhere that conservation and indigenous communities are. So I think that's true. And we were having a conversation yesterday with a group in Ecuador, and the land tenure can be an issue because we're asking people sometimes to change their practices on land, and if they don't own the land, then that becomes complicated, because if the government wants to do one thing with that land and we're asking the community to do another thing with that land, then that makes it difficult. So land tenure can be a complicated issue, and as conservation folks, we don't have control over that necessarily. So, but sometimes even then, the land tenure, like we're talking to another group in Argentina a couple of days ago, and even though the group did not own the land, the government was providing incentives for better practices, and what we were asking them to do, overlapped with that. So in that case, it will work because the government recognized that best practices were going to be cheaper and more efficient for them in the long run. So so land tenure, I think, can complicate things sometimes. Yeah.
So I think what is really obvious here is that there's so many stakeholders involved, and I think that like this is pretty much the state with conservation in any part of the world. And Diego, especially for you, you mentioned sort of like some very unique and diverse stakeholderships between local communities, indigenous groups, with governments, with state governments, with national governments. And sort of, so between all of these stakeholders and between such a diverse array of stakeholders, how does governance of natural resources work? How does it work? How does it, or how have you and your work sort of helped in enhance these systems? Because I'm sure that once an enterprise becomes economically successful, building lasting and sustainable systems of governance becomes more and more important. So how do you, with so many players involved, what do you think has been sort of like the best system of governance, and how has that been built?
Yeah, well, I think that's a complex question, but I think what we have found to be the best strategies build bridges and bridges and bridges and bridges. That's pretty much it, because even when you have a unsuccessful story of conservation in one particular area, when you start to move forward to another place and they have a completely different interest, you have to once again kind of switch off your previous idea and go to this particular new reality and reconstruct what you want to try to align the narrative of conservation. And I think that that's happening to us at this particular moment. So in the highlands where we are working with coffee growers, we already have the idea of what they need, what they require, and what they are seeking. But now that we are moving forward to lowland indigenous territories, we see that they want something completely different. And somehow they see the strategies that we are applying in one place as a threat to what they want within their places, and that's perfectly fine. So by one side, within their land, we are trying to enforce, and not enforce, to improve the way they are managing their lands within their goals. So they want to maintain the ecosystems that secure a sacred place, for example. And we have to do that. So we have to reduce the pressures that we create by these economies, different economies, to ensure that goal is fulfilled. But we also have to start to show them that we, outside of their places, in areas that if they change really bad, they're going to impact somehow their territory. These other narratives can be helpful if we manage them properly. So we have with them working with the idea of the certification in places that are close to the river that at the end gets to their territory, and try to tell them, look, it's better if we talk with these people and we start to build these bridges of communication and see them as stakeholders that are going to impact our lands and have them as friends. Or we will have soon in another kind of enterprise that will transform that and will not have the same conversation. And all of that has to be somehow, and I think that's the most tricky part, managed and enforced in equilibrium with the legality and the legal and management rules that we have within the place, which is a mess because we have 7 different institutions that do not necessarily like each other. And even when they fulfill the same objectives, so one state and the other state have an environmental agency, they do not like to talk between them. But you have to manage that equilibrium.
Tell me about it.
You have to see how to ensure that all that we are building is going to fulfill different objectives, and within those different objectives, all of them will have their share, their part, and their goal fulfilled.
Thanks. So I think it is quite clear that the role of pretty much, I am a biologist as well, and when I started in the conservation field, I sort of figured, and thanks to a colleague of mine, Julie, you know him, Robin. So Robin's first message to me was conservation is 10% science and is 90% negotiations. And I think what you've been telling me, Diego, is making that clearer and clearer. So it's a huge part of your job. Because you are a scientist by training and a conservation and a wildlife biologist. So what is like a huge chunk of your work? Is it community liaison and negotiation? Is it awareness building, or is it the science and the research? What
No,
do
I
you spend
think
most time in?
day by day we move away from the full science part. So we have a team within the NGO that works directly now in doing the things that I love to do when I start this. That was putting the camera traps and going to the field and
Yeah,
those kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
things. And day by day, what you are saying, we are more in this negotiation and building bridges and finding common places and finding the way to achieve that, because that's not only like move the narrative and make the idea, but find the resources, find the legal way to do it, ensure that you will have the money. Julie knows that more than I do, ensuring that you will have the money to keep on running your team and your things
yeah,
for another year. So part of that gets a huge chunk today of my time. But the good thing is that we have been, and I think it's something that most of conservation practitioners do, is try to find people within their territories, within their land, and other entities or institutions that are doing similar things, and try to work together, and that helps you move some of that load. So at this moment, we are doing a bunch of science, but we are focusing on that science being made by the local universities or by other kind of actors, so we can move forward our efforts in management and conservation narratives and those kind of things.
yeah. Thanks. So I think yeah, it's quite clear that I mean conservation or human-centric conservation, at least across the world, functions on the same principles. So Diego, I mean you have talked about the success stories in Sierra Nevada. What are your plans for, say, scaling up? Because I mean, if you look at climate targets of the world, and if you look at the net zero targets by 2050, I mean, there is great stuff happening across the world, but but for life to exist on Earth beyond a certain point in time, we need to be able to scale all of our initiatives, and scale rapidly. And in the process of scaling out, we also have to ensure that we scale deep and that we do not forget the depth of each of these initiatives and of each of these projects. So, what would be your strategy for scaling out, and what would be your recommended strategy for scaling out to other sustainable entrepreneurs?
Well, I think, well, more than that, what I think, what we are trying to do is to ensure that whatever decision we make and how we move forward has I will say, two main foundations. One, the conservation science that support it. And I think that take us a lot of time within the Jaguar friendly certification, because we wanted to be extremely sure that the impact that we were going to do in a farm or in a landscape actually improves the conservation of the species, and it's not just a label that you put in a product. That's pretty hard to do, and it takes time, effort, resources. But I think at the end, that's what move us toward the idea of, okay, we are making an impact. This little thing that we are doing in this particular place is ensuring that the animal can move, or that the animal can live within those kind of things. And the second one, which I think is even harder than the science, is keep and ensure that balance between the different objectives and narratives of the social component that ensures the function of a territory is still moving forward, and it still exists, and it's included within the planification. And I think part of the other part that take us a lot of time creating the Jaguar friendly thing is that we have to be clear with the local owners that that's what they want, and that's complete somehow how they see their landscape, and they do not see it just as a way to get more money, but actually interiorize, okay, we are helping the jaguars because it's important for this, for this, for this, even if it's my enemy in my own conception, or even if I don't believe it should be here, I understand that it's the ecology of the system and those kind of things. If those two particular fundaments or like main bases are clear, I think you can move the idea to different places and keep on moving it in different places. And that's what we are doing right now. We are moving the certification to different mountain landscapes, some more transformed than others, with different realities, maybe with different species. But the idea is it's pretty much the same. Let's understand from the science perspective what the species need. Let's understand what people need, and build a bridge between those two things to create something that can be helpful.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks. I think, Julie, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Like, I think it is safe to say that the way coffee is in Latin America, tea serves the same sort of purpose or enterprise sort of way in the Eastern Himalayan zone. But I mean, what seems obvious to me is that I think that the sort of like the amount of work that's sort of gone in, you know, the amount of science, the amount of research, and the amount of sort of real hard work that has gone in to really scale up and to have multiple jaguar-friendly coffee programs and sort of multiple coffee plantations, we have probably not been able to reach that same scale here in the Eastern Himalayas, right? So how do you think that tea really can become a more sustainable enterprise in this part of the world? And what are the learnings that we sort of, I think, need to bring? Because I think that there are a lot of commonalities in terms of governance, in terms of different wildlife. So how do you think that scale can be achieved in this part of the world? Because I think that will really define conservation outcomes for the Asian elephant, at least, and sort of many other forms of wildlife that depend on the existence of the elephant.
I think it's totally possible, and I think it's going to be driven by the marketplace. And we are getting. Diego has met Lisa. By the way, they've sat down and met each other and have discussed collaboration even. And Lisa Mills and Scott Mills are help us with our elephant-friendly tea program, which is in Assam and other places. And so we are getting some big brands inquiring, and when the big brands inquire, we either work backwards to where they're already sourcing to see if we can certify those tea gardens, or we connect them with someone we've already certified. So I think the market, that people love the stories, and so I think it's really the stories, these complex but really incredibly compelling stories, that are going to drive the market. And I think that speaks to business people. I think, you know, the danger is that people see that possibly they're going to make money off this, but maybe they're not completely bought into the idea. So we always, you know, start, as Diego said, with the people that sort of feel this in their bones already, and this is the way they're going to operate their business no matter what. But as you do scale out, you have to be careful about greenwashing, and that, you know, you're not starting to get inquiries from people that really are only looking at it as a business opportunity, and not a sort of a way to change the system and move to a more sustainable system. So, you know, that's the overarching goal as we scale up, is to just be careful, just as careful as we've been all along, that we're bringing in the people that are the real thought leaders in the space, and that can be evangelists for other people in the industry to change practices where practices need to be changed. So I think it has to be done carefully and slowly to protect the integrity of the work, but I think it's totally possible. It's just, we all, I think, get a little frustrated because of how long these things take, but that's just the way it is. I mean, change is hard and change takes a long time, but we have to do it, so.
Yeah, thanks. So I think, I mean, I would sort of like to sum up here and I think highlight on some of the very interesting points that have come up in the last sort of hour. And the real reason why we sort of stressed on this here, thanks to the virtual medium, to try and talk to people doing great things from across the world, Diego and Julie, was to really sort of figure out sort of like the best practices from across the world. and to use this forum as a means to create a blueprint for the Eastern Himalayas, not just for the northeastern states of India, but for Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar as well. And I think there's the commonalities are that we need to be able to figure out sort of fusion systems of governance. I think that is key, because I think systems of governance, I mean, there are great indigenous systems of governance, but they sort of work in silos across the world. And there are great things happening in Canada, for example, which we are not aware of. There are great things happening in Colombia, which we are not aware of. So I think it is probably important more now than ever to create sort of like a global movement towards bringing ecology back into economy, and of sort of really using all of our forces to create this movement and to make this change happen. So thanks a lot, Diego and Julie. We will be in touch with you sort of to organize more intense brainstorming sessions while we build this blueprint, because we will need the help of experts. And these blueprints will be submitted to the governments. And we hope that this sort of is something that we can implement soon. And we are sure that this will not only create great impact on the environment, but also on the people that share space with the environment. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Dey, for joining us today and agreeing to be part of the 8th Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum. We're very excited to have you with us and to hear your thoughts on local self-governance based on your extensive expertise through AHEAD initiatives. So my first question to you would be, existing local self-governance structures in India are relatively weak compared to the full arena of control and opportunities they have on paper. So how do we strengthen these structures and systems to bring them to their full potential, particularly in the area of natural resource management and governance?
Well, first, let me tell you that it's a privilege to be here speaking to you at this particular webinar that you have in place, and also with regard to something close to my heart and something that I think should be discussed by all people who are in the field of development and working towards redefining a new development paradigm, which I think is the need of the day. I think the first and foremost thing that most of us who work with the development in the development arena is not to try to create another externally funded center of power within the community. And that generally happens not just by NGOs, but also by government departments. So you have these myriad committees within a village or within an area. It's a forest committee run by the forest department. You have a transformer committee, which is run by the power department. You have a village health and sanitation committee, which is run by the health department. And then you have also the NGO has a village committee. And depending on the amount of funds that these committees have, they tend to really, to a large extent, weaken the structures that should have been there, which are defined in the Act. So local government itself becomes meaningless because these committees are much more powerful. And because also they have a lot more funds. So if we really want to try to strengthen these, the local government structures as they've been enacted, even though, there might be a lot of flaws in them, would be to try to get people to work with these local government structures rather than supplanting them with their own structures. So, which is why one of the strategic, well, not just strategic, I mean, it's almost the basis of our existence, so to speak, is that we don't, head initiatives of which I'm a part of, we don't work directly in any area, but we try to support the local government structure in that area and try to be a catalyst so that they can take up an initiative and we can support it. The other very strong, I think, pitch that we need to make is that we need to understand that that the education system itself doesn't really cater to any understanding of local government structures, in spite of them being so important, because we are looking to try and put in place a similar structure that they had at the outset, or at least integrated with that, which is a much more participatory, open sort of democracy structure. So if we need to have that level of participation, and it's not just about, putting a vote in every 5 years, but having people work together to plan and to implement various initiatives, take the responsibility for these things in their own area, then this has to be very much part of the educational system that we have. So in the school, we've tried to get going a module where we involve children with local government and to try and understand how it works. So if we have a lot more participation from people, from the community at large, and if we ready the next generation to be much more responsive to local government, then I think that the nature of local government itself will start changing. We need to have a diversity of cultures addressing these issues about what it's all about. And in which case, freedom to these diverse cultures is a prerequisite for any sort of progress. And if they don't have that freedom, then these cultures slowly will die away. And unless the people themselves try to understand that the need for being part of the structure and making it vibrant and taking into their own hands the decisions that actually affect them, and also how this can happen as part of the local government structure, to try to understand the local government structure itself and be educated about it, then we'll never have an open participatory democracy in place, which I think is probably what we all want as far as, giving communities that freedom. So that would probably be the way forward. And that would address many issues. One is the sort of systems of local government structures that are in place everywhere in India and also elsewhere in the world. That how can these be actually integrated with the present system of governance? Some people would probably say that, that's almost impossible. And therefore, it's much better to do away with the nation state as it stands today and, have your own system of government. And, but there have been some examples where, a friend recently, we've been doing a series on living utopias, how the Zapatista in South America has functioned, how the kibbutz in Israel has functioned, or for that matter, the Amish community in America, that people have been able to, control their own lives, lead their own lives, and still be part of the overall structure. So that would probably be the way to go and try to integrate the two. In the context of the forests, what we probably ideally would like to see is that communities themselves are the custodians of the forests, that they see it as their physical heritage and not something that belongs to the government that they need to exploit and benefit from. And if that is instilled in them, that it is their physical heritage and they are the custodians of those forests, then they would automatically use them sustainably, and they would protect them, and they would protect the biodiversity of those forests as well, because that's their means to life. So that education also needs to come into play. I mean, there again, we have, the sort of urban-centric syllabus or curriculum that we have for schools throughout India, where this localization or the local geography, the local history, or the local needs of understanding of that these aren't very much, they aren't part of the overall curriculum framework for rural school children, or for that matter, children who live close to forests or close to the desert or close to the sea, the coastal areas. So each would have, there needs to be a certain amount of localization. And if this localization and education takes place, and if you understand that one of the important components of that localization also needs to be local government, and the understanding and of local government and how it functions and their role in it, then I think we would have a much more vibrant tier at the lowest level.
I think it'll be interesting if you can talk maybe a little more in the North Bengal context about communities' involvement with forests. So you brought up forests, and there are on paper again rights and privileges regarding forests, but there's also kind of tensions here involved, and there's poor capacity to really manage these forests. So how, especially within the context of the Forest Rights Act, how must both the awareness and capacity of local self-governance structures be enhanced for this?
The Forest Rights Act that you mentioned, I mean, important, though it is a very important act, and one that, a lot of organizations can try to use, but it is a central government act. And the problem with the Forest Rights Act is it hasn't been reconciled with many other acts which are there in place with regard to the forests. So what has happened, in fact, in West Bengal, or I think in most places in India, is that the Forest Department tends to give much more precedence to the other acts that are in place, and not so much to the Forest Rights Act. And here, organizations that are working with communities who live in forests or live close to forests, they try to make people aware of their rights as with regard to the Forest Rights Act. But this idea of rights itself is, there is somebody who is giving you that right, and you are accessing that right. So it is, again, a system that you perhaps don't want in place. You want in place something where they have control of what that act should be, what those rules should be. I mean, how they will govern and how they will protect their forests, ideally. But yes, to start with, and another problem that we've noticed with the Forest Rights Act is we work within the Simlipal Bioreserve as well, where we work with 3 gram panchayats, is that it again, like many other departments, creates another committee. So you have a committee of forest, for the Forest Rights Act, and which will implement all the rights that have been given to forest dwellers, etc., etc. And that committee is defined. So that again is, perhaps it's supposed to be. I've tried to read the act. It doesn't say much, but it's actually generally constituted apart from the local government structure that is already in place as part of the panchayati system. What we had tried to do here in West Bengal was that we had put in place not just a Gram Sabha, but a Gram Sabha working group, which it would be an open committee, but obviously there'd be some who would come much more to the forefront and be part of the working group and take forward the sort of decisions or the plans that were formulated at the Gram Sabha. So now all other committees need to arise from that Gram Sabha committee that you have, or that working group that you have. So they are subcommittees, so to speak. And if it had been formulated in that fashion, perhaps the forest committees would have been effective.
So I think I'll just wrap up with one last question, because you've covered quite a bit. So if you had 3 recommendations, 3 key recommendations you could make for the way forward for local self-governance, what would those recommendations be?
We need to desist from working directly with in areas and try to work with local self-government structures. I mean, I'm talking not just about non-government organizations, I'm talking about the state government as well. I'm talking about the central government as well, that they need to be a catalyst. They need to provide resources. They need to provide support, but the initiative must be that of that local government. They must have ownership of that initiative, and they must see the need for it, and not implement it because somebody else wants to implement it. The second, I think, is in the arena of education, because I'm not only talking about school education, but I'm talking about education as envisaged in the Sustainable Development Goal 4, that education should be for all ages, and it should be, and we should try to promote the idea of lifelong learning, that learning is lifelong. So we need to have structures at the community level, not somewhere far away at the local town or at where the organization has developed a complex where they have a training hall, but within the community, which is accessible to them, to all of them, including the women and men who are actually struggling every day with their own livelihoods, and they might really not have the time to go and attend a training program. So if there's an institution like that where people can access lifelong learning, and we also think about school education, we need to incorporate all the issues that we think are important, be that as local government, which I was talking about, or with regard to forests, with regard to biodiversity. All these issues need to be part of education. They need to be part of lifelong learning. They need to be accessible at the community level. what we've been trying to promote is the idea of a creative learning space, you know, which could be, which could function within the community and provide not only skills, but knowledge, preserve indigenous knowledge, you know. So if that could be part of the school education and could also be part of the sort of, you know, the institution that we try to develop towards lifelong learning, I think these together would address many issues, not just issues regarding biodiversity and forests, etc., but all the other development issues that, you know, we think about, whether it's with regard to gender, whether it's regard to health or sanitation or agriculture or sustainable agriculture, what have you. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we really appreciated it. And there's a lot that we can do going forward from here.
Hi, Ben Powless. Thanks a lot for joining us from Canada to share your insights into some very pertinent matters of the current times and things that are very pertinent in changing the future for the world as well. So Ben, I'd like to jump right into actually talking about how Indigenous communities have really always been on the front lines of climate change and its challenges. And this has been the case across the world. And based on your vast experience with the environmental justice movement in Canada, could you share some perspectives on what sort of the current challenges are and what have been some of the successful actions that have created not only sustainability, but also social equity? Over to you, Ben.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'll start with some of the challenges first. You know, we understand that climate change is really probably one of the most significant issues facing our entire species, our entire generation. And that's no more true for anybody than for a lot of Indigenous communities around the world. But including in Canada, I think a lot of people would be sort of surprised to sort of understand a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada still rely upon the environment, still rely upon the sort of often very remote places where they live to sustain them. A lot of communities in Canada, a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada are fairly remote still, which means that in often cases, especially the farther north you go, as you get further and further close to the Arctic, for example, a lot of these communities are fly-in communities, for example. Some of them don't even have road access throughout the year. And so this means that, you know, in places like that, prices are exorbitantly high already for basic things like food. Sometimes even water has to be flown in cases of industrial pollution. And in these communities, what we're already starting to see is that a lot of the traditional hunting, fishing, gathering, trapping of animals is starting to become a little bit more threatened. We started to see a lot of impacts on a lot of other species that our communities depend upon. Probably the most famous that people are aware of in Canada is the case of the polar bear, which is expected to potentially go extinct by the end of this century. And you know, we have a lot of other species like that form sort of the basis of the ecology and the ecosystems that a lot of communities sort of depend upon. But beyond just those sort of species, climate change is a fundamental threat to, you know, the entire sort of ecosystem that we all sort of depend upon. It threatens our water systems. In some places, we know that it will create more droughts, particularly in places like central Canada, where, you know, a lot of the food supply, for example, could dry out. I think Canada produces about 40% of the world's wheat supply, for example. You know, and that's a tremendous amount of food for the rest of the world. Other places we expect to see massive amounts more of rain. So we have issues with flooding, for example. We know a lot of indigenous communities live along the coasts. We have 3 coasts in Canada: the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic. And all those communities are threatened in different sort of ways, to the extent that we've already seen some communities in Canada have to start to relocate as the sea level has already started to begin to rise and started to destroy the community. And so in response to that, what we've seen is that a lot of communities have started to take some proactive action. They've begun, I think that the most important thing that they're doing is starting to really try and document the things and the changes that are happening. And that allows them to use that as a sort of pressure for, say, for example, governments or NGOs or businesses to sort of say, hey, this is what's happening to our communities, this is what's happening to our people, this is how we need things to change in the future. A lot of this leverages upon what we sort of call traditional indigenous knowledge. And so it's the ability of elders to say, well, in this territory, the ice typically freezes at this time of the year, but now it's freezing a month later, and it means that these animals and this are impacted. And it allows those people to go to the governments and other groups and say, this is what we are seeing on the ground, and this is how we need support. This is how we need potentially funding or infrastructure to be built to respond and help make these communities more adaptable and sustainable. One of the sort of primary things that these communities makes these communities more resilient in the long run, though, is the ability to do this for themselves. The ability for these communities to sort of exist and basically in a form of their own self-determination, to be able to enact these kind of policies, enact these kind of changes themselves, because they are the ones who best know how to respond locally. We have a federal government, we have provincial governments, but they're not on the ground. They're often 1,000 miles away, and unable to sort of understand what the actual local circumstances are. So the best sort of solution, I think, in the long term, is to really try and empower these communities to be able to do that for themselves. And I mentioned to you before, but one of the sort of most interesting examples that we have in Canada is of Indigenous self-government. There's a number of different models, but one of the ones that's, I think, most interesting for this purpose is the situation of the Cree communities of northern Quebec, who have their own sort of self-government model. And so, I think that this is an interesting sort of way to sort of say, hey, there's a way that Indigenous communities can govern themselves and respond to these sort of things without necessarily needing higher levels of government to support them or come in and make decisions for them, but they're able to sort of respond and say everything from a local level in terms of, here's how we're going to respond to, fishing and hunting regulations, all the way up to higher levels that say, okay, here's how infrastructure is going to be infected. Here's how roads might have to be changed. Here's how electricity is going to be generated. So these kind of things, looking at any sort of community anywhere in the world, those are the kind of things that really help them to be sort of empowered, at the most local level that really affects people on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, man. I think that's a really fascinating example. So if you could tell us a bit more about the Cree community and the Grand Council that we've talked about earlier, because I think it's a really fascinating example for Indigenous management of natural resources. And this, I believe, is really the need of the hour, not just in the Eastern Himalayas, but across the world. If we are to save ourselves from climate change, and if Indigenous communities are to save themselves from the wrath of climate change. So if you could tell us more about how the Grand Council works, I think that'll be very interesting for our audience. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. And of course, the part of the historical context that's maybe interesting too is, of course, Canada was a British colony, same as India. And so there's a lot of similarities in terms of the legal aspects and the jurisdictional aspects there. But what the history there basically is that you have 9 communities in northern Quebec that govern an area, a massive area. I can't even remember the exact size of it, but it's the size of a small United States state. And there's only about 20,000 people sort of living in the area. It's very northern. It's very sort of remote. But what happened was, I think in the 1970s, the federal government wanted to put in a massive hydroelectric dam into the community. And a lot of the people were opposed because it would create a massive amount of flooding and would destroy a lot of their sacred lands and resources in the area. And so those communities had never worked together before. They had always sort of been sort of separate communities, but they decided that, well, to sort of battle this one project, we need to sort of come together. And in doing so, they formed this governance council, this Cree Nation government, that today sort of works on behalf of all those communities. And even beyond that, it took about 20 years of negotiation, but they managed to form an agreement with the federal government with provincial governments that basically recognizes them as the sort of main government in action. And so what this means is that instead of the federal government and provincial governments coming in and saying, okay, here's what is going to happen in your community, here's what you're going to do, these governments pretty much simply supply mostly funding to the Cree Nation, and the Cree Nation is able to sort of enact that. And so they're able to do everything from administer their own health policies. They have their own education system. They have their own justice system. They have their own police system. But for our purposes, most importantly, they also administer and control their own natural resources as well. And so now, if communities want to, say, for example, build renewable energy, for example, that's entirely within their power to do so. And they are allowed to, say, go to NGOs or to private businesses to get potentially capital to do that. And they're able to sort of invest in their own communities. They're able to control their own sort of resources and their own funding, and also gain the benefits back from that. So that also allows them to keep that money within the community, to create employment and jobs in the communities, and basically keep those kind of investments going forward, planning for long-term planning for multiple generations to come. And so this is, I think, potentially an interesting model that a lot of communities could look forward to and sort of benefit from that sort of idea, if not the exact same model, at least the idea of having this kind of level of autonomy, of self-governance, but also of local control over resources going forward.
Thanks, Ben. And I think I think we, through the kind of work that we do at the Bali Para Foundation, we've been trying to build similar systems around the forests and around the resources of the forest. But I believe that, globally, there is a growing movement for Indigenous governance led by Indigenous people. But the progress made by the Crees in northern Quebec is amazing and uncomparable. But what is really surprising to me is that till I spoke to you the last time, I didn't even know about it, and I sort of work in the scene. So there's great initiatives happening, but they are sort of atomized, and including initiatives that are happening within just the Eastern Himalayan region. So through your background, through the environmental justice movement work that you've done, but also your background as a keen photographer, how do you think that we bridge the gaps between all of these initiatives for learning across, not just across nations, but across cultures, to sort of promote growth between communities and I think thereby really being able to enhance communities' capacity for self-governance by sort of showing them that there's other communities across the world that are doing great things and that it's actually worked out, like for the Crees. How do you think we can make that leap happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of talking about the need to sort of communicate and kind of bridge those gaps. And I think one of the sort of, best ways that we can do that is sharing our stories and getting those stories out there. Because fundamentally that's, that's what all of our communities are, is a collection of our stories, of our own histories. And so it's through understanding those that we were able to sort of spread and share those kind of ideas and let them take hold. And so I'm a great proponent of those kind of exchanges. I think probably the most useful thing is actual exchanges of people, of being able to visit a place and actually see it for themselves. And I've been fortunate enough to do that in many places, traveling to different parts of the world, and as a photographer, as a photojournalist, documenting those sort of local realities of indigenous communities from everywhere from South America to parts of Asia to Europe to Africa. And I think those have been sort of really, really sort of important to actually understand the local situation and understand also the differences. Of course, not everything can be sort of replicated 100%, but to understand that those realities can be sort of shifted and can be sort of changed. Unfortunately, we're dealing with this sort of global pandemic right now, which doesn't permit us to actually physically travel the same way that many would like to. But I still think, looking forward to the future, that could still be one of the sort of most useful things, if there was a possibility to do those kind of exchanges, to do that kind of learning where people can sort of travel to an area and sort of learn about it for themselves. But since we don't have that right now, perhaps one of the most useful things that we do have is the ability to share, through whatever other media that we have right now. And probably the most engaging that we have is of course, through videos, like we're doing today, through photos, through stories. Social media has been sort of a tremendous tool for allowing us to get our stories out there. Nowadays, a person from a remote community anywhere in the world is able to sort of, become a spokesperson and share their stories, share their own history, share their own reality, and get that out there. And I think that that's a, dramatically empowering tool for a lot of our communities to be able to say, hey, this is what's happening in my community. Here's what I'm seeing on the ground. Here's how, for example, climate change is impacting my community here. Here's how the water levels are changing. Here's how the rain patterns are shifting. Here's how our growing seasons are becoming affected. And, being able to share that with somebody around the world who, maybe lives in the Arctic, from India, and say, oh, here's our situation. You have, plus 40 degrees. We have minus 40 degrees here. And here's how that situation is changing and evolving over, the past years, the past decades as a result of climate change. So those kind of exchanges, I think, are incredibly useful and very powerful. It's something that wasn't possible even just a few years ago. And so I think it's going to be even more interesting as we go into the future to see all the ways that we can sort of shift perspectives, to sort of allow ourselves to understand what it's like to live in the eyes of somebody else in another part of the world, and understand that kind of perspective where they're coming from. And so I think that that's really the one of the most useful things that we have right now, is to be able to share those stories and get them out there in a sort of compelling way, to really help people understand what it is, and all the ways that they can also make a difference as well. That has to be one of the biggest parts of the message that we're communicating, is that it's not just about documenting, but it's also about making a change. It's about, and I think we're starting to see that more and more in the world right now. We're seeing bigger and bigger social movements than have ever existed before, as people become more and more aware of these issues, as people sort of say, hey, I'm not just witnessing something that's happening. I'm able to change it. I'm able to sort of demand things of governments, of corporations, of NGOs, that I want to see them make a difference in where I live. And so we're starting to see that more and more, is that people are not just engaged, but are actually pushing for real change. And I think that that's a trend that's not going to go away anytime soon. It's only going to get stronger and stronger as, of course, all of our worlds become more and more sort of intertwined. You know, we have people that are living in the most remote parts of the world who are able to track the human rights situation in, you know, India, who are tracking the situation in Hong Kong, in Peru, in Canada. And so these are the realities of our very much interconnected world, is that we're all able to sort of chat with each other and understand each other, but also stand in solidarity and support with each other. And so I think that that's going to be an increasingly useful and important trend that we're going to see coming forward.
Thanks, Ben. And I think the reason why we sort of took our conference this year across the world and sort of we looked out to people like you so we could have your experiences is that really, I think thanks to COVID, we've taken to the virtual medium, and this is the 8th edition of the forum, but the first virtual edition. And I think that through this virtual edition, at a time more important than ever, we really hope to be able to create a global movement towards bringing ecology back into the economy. And through conversations such as these, we hope to be able to come out with policy recommendations, not just for India, but for the Eastern Himalayan countries, and sort of recommendations that will help and support and boost indigenous governance systems. So Ben, thanks a lot for your time. I think our audience will really love all that you've had to say, and they will be reaching out to you for any further questions, if that's all right, Ben. Thank you.
Perfect, yes.
very, very much. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khosla, for joining us today at the 8th Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum. Through Development Alternatives, the Club of Rome, and your really, really vast experience across multiple organizations over the years, always at leadership positions, you have been on the forefront of some of the conversations of sustainable development, and many of which have actually brought us to this whole question where today countries, or in fact, the whole globe, is talking about the question of ecology is in the forefront of economy, and ecology is economy, and it is the future is in green jobs. Your work has also focused on the question of civil society and how its power can actually drive sustainable development. Coming to the Eastern Himalayan region specifically, just to contextualize it, we seek your views and your advice and guidance to actually explore the way forward for this Eastern Himalayan region through a couple of key transitions in a couple of areas, which are: one is natural assets, 2 is employment generation, 2 is achieving net zero, 4 is actually creating awareness about what we call naturenomics, the interdependence between nature and economics, and this whole new paradigm of animal transmitted human diseases or zoonotic diseases. How can we mitigate the same? Just to contextualize the whole thing, there have been a lot of conversation globally lately about green recovery, the green reset, creation of green jobs, the Green New Deal, as the ways out of this COVID-19 crisis. What, in your mind, sir, is the role of civil society, especially in our country, that the civil society can play in leading the way for a national Green New Deal or recovery plan for green and sustainable jobs for people?
Thank you, Prabir. You've asked pretty deep questions, and I can see I'm going to have a hard time being able to meet your expectations. You know, the first thing that we need to do is to look at the problem. And the problem statement that you've given me is that there is a system that is broken. And you know, it wasn't COVID that broke the system. COVID only exposed a system that was already totally broken. So one has to recognize that when we talk about the economic theories and the economic practices, the running of economies as a whole, we have to recognize that they haven't worked. either for people, for large numbers of people. They work very well for a few small number of people, but they haven't worked for the vast majority. And these neoclassical economic theories, which depend on outdated ideas like greed is good, like everybody knows has perfect information, like markets are the only way to get the optimal use of resources, that capital comes before labor or other resources in terms of its priority. These are issues that we have to deal with. They're very fundamental issues. And the same applies to the economy. A neoliberal economy, which is more or less what we have most around the world, including India, predicates itself on having a totally open, unregulated market, which essentially is supposed to drive efficient production and consumption systems, but in fact ends up by leaving virtually everyone behind, other than the few who have started with a great deal of capital and assets. So we need fundamental changes, and the changes that we need are so deep that they don't actually happen on their own. In my opinion, there are only three things that can bring about the kinds of fundamental changes that we need in our systems of governance, in our economic systems, and particularly in the behavior of people, the behavior patterns, the value systems which guide us in how we do things, such as consume materials and products, how we relate to each other, and how ultimately we relate to nature. And these three things, basically, in my opinion, are charisma, the charisma of a Lord Buddha or a Jesus Christ or a Mahatma Gandhi, which are major sources of changes in mindsets and behaviors. But they only happen once in 1,000 years, unfortunately. So right now, we've recently had one of these charismatic leaders, and it may be some time before we get another one. The second is crises. Crises like wars, like basically financial crises and pandemics. And the third one, which is really an extreme crisis, which collapse, when things actually break down altogether. And that's when you can, if you time it right, bring about real fundamental change. What is the change that we need? Well, we need to now redesign our economic systems and our political systems to value people, resources, nature. We need to value the need for resilient systems so that they don't get completely out of whack when some small change occurs. Systems that can come back to reasonably stable and productive positions that are not easy to do with the present systems. And this means that we need to cultivate new relationships. As I say, the relationships between people and nature is only one of them, people and people and machines, the way we deal with technologies. So, Prabir, I would say that civil society is crucial in bringing about these changes in the way we perceive the world, in the way we relate to each other. And that is because the other sectors, the major sectors like government and business, are not able to do these things. They're too much dyed in their original wool and not able basically to think of new things. Government is supposed to be for the good of the people, but it only thinks of the people at the time of elections or when it needs its tax rupees. Otherwise, government couldn't really care less. But it doesn't matter which party it's from. It's the nature of government to perpetuate itself, not to service the people. And business, of course, is not even in the business of looking at these issues. Its job is to make money, and it doesn't matter how it makes money. As long as it conforms to the laws of the land, is legally compliant, it can get on with the job of making money, and it's not intended to create well-being for people except peripherally, except incidentally as the result of his work. There are other people, there are other sectors, but I think the big third sector called civil society, which includes NGOs, it includes academic institutions, it includes media, it includes faith organizations, the temples, the mandirs, the churches and the mosques. These are the civil society that actually brings about a fundamental change in thinking. Our educational systems are very important, and so is the family, so is the community. And civil society is where we belong. Now, today, I think in your questions, you talk about civil society, we're talking largely about NGOs, voluntary organizations, people who put their professional careers on the line to help bring about change. And you know, civil society is very good at certain kinds of things. It's very good at service delivery. If you need schools or you need nutrition or you need healthcare, civil society can take on jobs that governments and businesses just can't do. It's good at research, it's good at analysis, and above all, and I think one of the most important things which is forgotten in India, is that it's good for advocacy of new models of development. You know, it's civil society that created much of what we believe to be important in our lives. Civil rights, gender equality, environment, human rights, right to information, social enterprises. These are things that would not have happened if NGOs had not created a huge pressure on governments and on businesses to do these things. The laws on these things didn't come automatically from inside some benign government. They came because they were demanded by civil society. Emerging issues now, you know, issues relating to women's empowerment, child welfare, care of the aged, things like dealing with disabled people, and now with pandemic diseases becoming more and more frequent, civil society is going to play a very strong role. And the reason it can do things that others don't do very well is that it has a tendency to take the holistic view, the integrated approach, and it's very important for civil society solutions generated by civil society to be systemic, to go to the root causes, to figure out ways in which to create new normals, not to go back to business as usual, but to be able to bring about a society that is better for everyone. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just want to add on to this. Would your logic and your thought process also apply to the latest global talking point of the year, especially leading up to COP26, which is achieving net zero?
Yeah, well,
what
you know,
civil society's role in actually, you know, shifting the paradigm with the research, with the analysis, with the advocacy to ensure that India does achieve its net zero targets?
Profoundly important. It's a very good question. The issue, Prabir, is that net zero is a terminology. It's a little piece of jargon. But what it means is that overall, our carbon emissions will be brought down overall to zero, which means that those that we do emit for necessary activities, human and economic activities, are compensated for by sequestration, by absorbing into things like forests and wetlands and algae and so on. So net zero is simply a jargon term saying that the total amount of carbon emission is going to be offset by measures to absorb it into permanent sequestration. Now, for me, net zero really applies way beyond carbon. Carbon is important. Climate change is a great existential threat to our life support systems, to humanity, to species, to life on Earth. But the fact of the matter is that there are other things we do, including the use of resources, materials, and so on, generating waste. There are a lot of ways in which net zero becomes important. Net zero means just to be able to ensure that we don't clutter up the world with the with the consequences of generating waste. So we talk about ecological footprints, which should be in a sense net zero. We talk about wastes, which should be net zero. And now we've got new terminologies like green activities and new ways of resetting our economy, the circular economy. In fact, I belong to an NGO that is now 35 years old called Zero Emissions Research and Initiative, ZERI. These are, old terminologies and thoughts which need to be repackaged every generation so that people can buy into them. But they all stem from the idea of sustainable development. They all come essentially as different ways in which we contribute to a sustained future for all living beings on this planet. There are many traditional systems that now need to be, be refound, re-energized, so that we have approaches that are proactive and preventive, because traditionally scarcity and limited resources made it essential that people lived with a conservative view of their relationship with nature. And now civil society has to promote technological change and behavioral change even more, of the kind I was just talking about, and to generate community level action as much as action at the national level, to make systems circular, to, in essence, be net zero. This means that you have to nurture local production systems for local consumption as much as possible. You have to actually go back to the Mahatma. Gandhian systems were, in fact, net zero. The whole concept of Gandhiji, he is known as a non-violence, he's known as a great politician and a political leader, he's known as a saint. But Gandhiji was one of the greatest ecologists who ever lived. He had it in his bones, he had it in his DNA, what ecology means. And I think, in a sense, the net zero concept of Gandhiji, which is that everyone has a decent life, well-being is something that no one should be deprived of. And you do that without destroying nature's ability to support us. So I would say net zero is crucial, and civil society has a very big role to play in that.
So if I could just try and sum up some of the key points that you've made, and focus on the Eastern Himalayan region, which the whole world knows is a region which is very, very nature capital rich. But this nature capital, sir, either is ignored, or it's unaccounted, or at best underaccounted. So just to come back to the concept of circular economy, net zero, green jobs, reset, this is a change which is an absolute imperative in today's day and age, especially when with this COVID crisis, the kind of reverse migration that has happened in a place like the northeast of India. You've got nature capital, you've got nature for business, you've got thousands and lakhs of people who've come back to their semi-urban or their rural homes, back from the cities. What are their opportunities for employment and livelihoods, unless it is nature-based in a place which has got abundant natural capital?
Yeah, you're right. Again, Prabir, let me say this, that what you say is true about the Northeast, about the Eastern Himalayas, a region that is lush with natural capital. But it's just equally true in desert Rajasthan. It's equally true in grasslands of Madhya Pradesh. It's equally true of everywhere. What you're saying, that you have access. Nature was very, very prolific. Mother Nature's bounty is amazing no matter where you are. So what you're saying actually works more or less, in my opinion, everywhere. whether it's in coastal zones or in the mountains or in the plains or in deserts or in forests. We are, in fact, talking about an economy that left people and nature behind. And that is something that is a national tragedy, not just in the Eastern Himalayas. Although what I'm going to say about, in response to your question, applies centrally, and I think 100% in your region, I believe it applies equally well virtually everywhere else. And that is that biodiversity and ecosystem services are extremely important and valuable for our, not just for our survival, but for our economy. That's why we say that economy is ecology and vice versa. Because a very large part, as I will try and tell you right now, of the human economy, the artificial economy, wouldn't work without the huge subsidy that nature provides it through clean drinking water. Or I'm not even talking about oxygen. Oxygen for breathing, without that, we would be dead. I'm not even talking about existential issues that nature supports us with. I'm just talking about pure economic value resources that it provides us with. It provides us with a huge amount of clean water, drinking water, irrigation water, water for our rivers, water for our transport, water of all kinds. It provides us with living, productive soils. It provides us with huge numbers of materials for our well-being, for our structures, for our shelters. It provides us with food, with pollination. You know, if we were to pollinate each plant that the bees and the birds and the bats and the butterflies pollinate, we would have spent literally tens of billions of dollars paying labor at the most slavish rates to do that for us. So, you know, nature does things for us which are worth literally trillions of dollars. In fact, in 1995, a paper by Robert Costanza and others in Nature showed that the contribution of nature to the global economy at that time, in 1995, when the global economy was only $20 trillion, the contribution of nature was $53 trillion. So you can not even begin to imagine the huge impact it has on our food systems, on our pharmaceuticals. You know, half our pharmaceuticals, drugs come from almost straight from nature. So it is not just the Eastern Himalayas and the northeast of India, it's all over the world that this applies to. TEEB, the economics of ecosystem services and biodiversity is all about the economy. And I love the title of this series of webinars because it's going to the heart of the matter. Our decision makers who are trained in economics don't understand this. They have no way of including in their classical calculations how to put in the value that nature gives us. So now we need new ways to capture this value. And I want to say that there are lots and lots of now tools being developed by organizations like Balipara Foundation, like ours, Development Alternatives, like ATRI in India and all over the world, which will help us figure out how to value. But the question is, how do we put that into our economic activities, our systems, our decision systems? How do we get decision makers to realize that making a road may well have a certain amount of contribution to the local economy because of the goods and services and movement and transport it provides. But if it destroys virgin forests, how much value you've lost. And that has never been captured adequately. I do also want to say that your question basically stated how rich the Eastern Himalayas are in terms of natural resources, but I also want to add that they're even richer in terms of human resources. That's where people really have shown their ability to live in harmony with nature and to live good lives. Some of them have migrated and have transferred their sort of occupations to other parts of India and the world, and quite rightly, because our economic systems didn't create enough jobs for them where they were. But I'm sure if you ask them where would they rather be, they would rather be at home. And so, you know, we've got to nurture the human resources, and the role of civil society in doing that is helping them develop the appropriate skills for that region and the ability to make livelihoods for themselves. And of course, civil society offers jobs and occupations in its own right, which they can also take advantage of.
Just to add on to what I've touched upon briefly about the reverse migration, how can the young people who are returning back be involved to catalyze civil society, both in terms of driving sustainable development, sustainable businesses in rural communities, as well as getting into the whole realm of local governance?
You know, Prabir, young people coming home to escape a crisis elsewhere is a very sad thing in some ways, but it's also an opportunity for a local economy to gain from that. Travel, migration is wonderful if it's voluntary, if people move because they want to move. But it's not if it's driven by the push of scarcity of jobs, of resources, and the pull of opportunity elsewhere. Nobody really wants to leave home, but they do because they have no choice. And millions in our country migrate seasonally and permanently, leaving behind families, disrupted lives, we need to learn how to create jobs in place, in situ. And you know, rich natural resources and human resources are something that everywhere exists, and we can create a lot of good jobs. And a large part of that is the responsibility of civil society. You know, governments don't create jobs. In India, the governments between the central and the state and the local governments employ something like 20, 21 million people. Business, big business employs what, 10 to 12 million people. But the rest of us have to find ways in which we create work and jobs for ourselves. And there's the medium sector, the medium scale sector, the small sector, the micro and mini industry sector. But most important of all, there's the informal sector, which creates the largest numbers of jobs in our country. So when we are looking at the role of civil society, it's really to open up such opportunities by bringing innovation in, by bringing new ideas about vocations, by helping people acquire skills, by helping them get access to finance. This is done in India at the local level largely by civil society. This finance may be done by government, but the access to it is done by civil society. And so you really now need to look at how in different parts of the country, and you know, DA, Development Alternatives, does it in central India and different parts of India. Paripara does it in Assam and other places. And we need to do this with an understanding that there's a deep need, a total commitment to equity, gender, age, leaving no one behind is basically what civil society is dedicated for. So on local community organizations can provide people who are returning from other parts of India because of the pandemic, can provide jobs. If you have a good NGO, you can get a job with them. If you don't, you can start one. But they're not the only ones. You can work with other kinds of organizations, particularly small businesses, and educational institutions, teaching in schools. So the future will actually depend on what we do today. Our generations inherited a wonderful earth with hugely productive natural resources. And we've got to think about how we leave behind for the next generations what we are going to do. And we can't do that by giving up our responsibilities for creating good jobs for ourselves and leaving behind a very powerful, how would you say, a very healthy and productive resource base. In a sense, because we had very good ancestors who left behind a terrific resource base for us, we have to think like being good ancestors to future generations. When our grandchildren ask, what did you do for us? We should be able proudly to say we left behind a good world. So I think your question about what young people have to do when they come home has to be to think through their larger role in society today and tomorrow.
And finally, how could the civil society, especially in the place like the Eastern Himalayas, play a pivotal role in creating awareness and preventing further spread of zoonotic diseases? Any place that is rich in natural assets and nature capital is also prone to other issues.
Having seen what has been going on in recent months, there is unquestionably a requirement that development in our nation be more resilient. If it can be brought to its knees by a single little virus, you have designed development completely wrong. There has to be a view in the future that we take care of all those resources. Some of them are built, hospitals, schools, institutions of all kinds, and our forests and our soils and our rivers and all the things that support us. So to have a resilient economy means you have to have a resilient ecosystem, and a resilient ecosystem means that when a zoonotic disease appears somewhere, it doesn't spread wildly all over the place, because we have our natural systems in balance and able to put a stop to the spread. So we have to not only preserve, we have to conserve our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, our rivers, our complete natural ecosystem to be so healthy that we do not have the spread of diseases. And on the contrary, we do have access to multiple sources of wealth. Infections or lifestyle diseases are issues that the young today must give a lot more credence to, because their lives will be disrupted badly if they don't. And now civil society is very good for creating awareness of these kinds of things, like we're trying to do right now in this webinar, providing services, rescue, relief, and rehabilitation when things do go wrong. But the most important thing is to build resilient, balanced systems that can grow and flourish without major perturbation and disruption. And I think that is really the task of the young people of tomorrow. Thank you.
Last observation. Can you explain the backdrop behind you, sir, on the screen?
One of the most important contributions to well-being for tomorrow is using better technologies. Technologies that utilize waste as raw materials, technologies that don't create waste as a waste to be disposed of. And one of the biggest areas in India for carbon emissions, for use of resources, scarce resources, and for generating waste is the construction sector. Making buildings requires huge amounts of soil and sand and cement and limestone and varieties of other things. And it not only basically destroys the countryside getting all these together, but also produces a large amount of waste. Now, if you see the building behind me, which is our headquarters for development alternatives in South Delhi, it was built with totally different kinds of technologies that we innovated, that we invented over the last 35 years in our organization to demonstrate that we do not have to rape Mother Earth to build our homes and our buildings. This building is made, more than 60% of it is made from waste materials, from fly ash, from thermal power stations, which have burnt their coal and left behind huge amounts of ash, from stone dust, from quarries and mines, from industrial waste, from mining waste, and from demolition waste, from old buildings that were demolished and we used in here. The amount of virgin material is less than 30 or 40%. And the amount of energy used in building, embedded in the building, is about 40% less than normal regular construction. And the amount that we use in terms of operational energy used is about 50% less, because our building is much better performing both in the summer as well as in the winter. The amount of water we use in this building was minimal. And at the moment, we have virtually zero water coming in from the outside, from the city services. So in a sense, in this building, we have been able to demonstrate the kind of ecosystem thinking that our economy should be utilizing all the time. This building is a kind of symbol as well as an example of how we can live with nature and live well. We've been offered an awful lot of money to rent space in our building to other people, but we need it for ourselves. So all I can say is that we find it important to be able to show that we're not talking just abstract future zero emissions. We have zero emissions right here behind us. Thank you.
As always, Dr. Khosla, on behalf of the entire team of Balipara Foundation, it was always an honor and pleasure to listen to you, your wisdom, your advice, and clarity of thought, and your understanding of the entire area of why ecology is economy. We remain grateful and indebted to you, sir. Thank you very, very much.